So last video of this week, who has all the oil, right? I mean, it's the big question. It turns out it's not the only question, right? Not only who has the oil, which if we think back to our earlier part of the class, is really a geologic accident, at least kind of where the oil is located. The next question is, who's selling, right? Who has it, who's selling, and who's buying, right? Those are kind of three different questions we could think about. So when we look at the price of oil, if you guys, hopefully remember, oil is one of those commodities where the price of oil is not necessarily something that reflects the cost of extraction. The price of oil is usually manipulated in one way or another. And actually, so here we can see this is a graph of the historical price of a barrel of oil. And one of the things that's kind of been in the news recently is people have been saying, hey, what the heck, are we at a new norm, right? So the price of oil was fairly stable, at least for the last 30, 40 years. And then there was some pretty pronounced chaos in that system. We all remember when gas was close to $5 a gallon. Personally, I was kind of cheering it on, right? Not that I want to pay more, but I do believe that, what's that famous phrase? Necessity is the mother of invention, right? So it's my personal thought that when we do start to see sustained gas at like $5 a gallon, that's when things like infrastructure start to change. So I've worked in Europe for 10 years, and I think the last time I was there was 2017, and I did the bar napkin math, how much it was in US dollars per gallon, which is euros and liters and all of that stuff. And in 2017 in Italy, they were spending about $8.75 US dollars per gallon, which really changes what transportation looks like. There's a lot of really fuel efficient vehicles, 50 miles per gallon is relatively standard. There's a lot of scooters, there's a lot of buses, there's a lot of trains. So there's a lot of other modes of transportation, and we don't have that infrastructure, right? We live out in the West, especially if you live a few miles outside of town, you're kind of out of luck. But if we were to start to see some of those things become more necessary, I think it would be great. But anyways, so going back to our diagram here, sorry for my personal rant there, but the price of gas has stayed relatively stable, but now it's also been relatively stable for the last few years, but it's at a much higher price. All right, so we're in the longest continuous span of what we think of as high oil prices. Well, hopefully we all remember OPEC, right? OPEC is what we think of as our global oil cartel, and they, in a very large way, a large part, not completely by themselves, but in a very large part, they control the price of oil. So OPEC, if you remember, OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, and their membership changes from time to time. Generally, it's fairly stable. But OPEC, the OPEC member states weren't following the rules in not that long ago, and they were overproducing. OPEC as an organization was not really enforcing the production limits, and that caused an oil glut, and the prices of oil dropped. And since then, OPEC has been much more stringent with controlling how much oil these nations are putting out. And like I said, they're basically throttling the supply, which is kind of controlling the price. I know it all sounds like pretty like a conspiracy theory, but it is in a way, right? I mean, the price that you pay at the gas pump, we like to complain about it a lot. And again, there are state taxes and federal taxes and things that are tacked onto that, fundamental cost. But what you pay at the gas pump is pretty much decided by OPEC, with maybe 70, 80 cents a gallon kind of within the United States as taxes and things. So of the OPEC nations, right? So of the countries involved in this organization, Not all of them are the same. So if you remember, I highlighted the fact that many of them politically would probably be totally obliterated if they were to go it alone, right? Many of these countries need the support of this larger organization to stay relevant. So here you can see this is a pie chart that shows us the production per country of the OPEC nations. And what becomes clear pretty quickly is that Saudi Arabia runs the show. Actually, the Middle East runs the show, and there are some other nations involved there as well. So just kind of looking at my cheat sheet here, you can see Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, United Arab Emirates, and Kuwait. That's 75% of the oil generated by OPEC, and the rest is made up of these smaller countries. The important thing to think about is that pie chart reflects production. Production is not tied to how much oil that country has. Production is tied to how much oil that country is currently pulling out of the ground. So if we're thinking about production as kind of the very real world today of the oil industry, keep in mind it's independent of how much oil the country has. It's how much they're actually using. So we are, or maybe have recently become, the largest oil producing nation on planet Earth. So you can see here, this is a graph showing the production levels, and you can see Russia topping the list, United States at number 2. Like I said, I think this may be about a year outdated. It's fairly recent, but we maybe have flip-flopped with Russia, but as you can see in this graph, that's kind of irrelevant at this point. And then it drops off pretty quickly after Saudi Arabia. But what I can't stress enough is this graph is really tied to the economy of the country. So the country is saying, okay, we need to make X amount of money off of our oil, and so they start selling oil. This graph doesn't represent which countries have oil, right? That's actually different. So this diagram is going to look much different, 50 years in the future. And we start to even think about other things that get wild. Like maybe 50 years in the future, nobody really uses oil anymore. Or we only use it for certain things, right? For ships and jets. Maybe algae has supplanted conventional fuels for cars. But that's speculation at this point. So this is a map, and hopefully it's kind of easy to understand. So it's not just limited to OPEC countries. These are really the primary oil-producing nations on the global scale. And this is the reserve. This is showing us how much oil the country has, which is much different than the graph that we saw before. The graph that we saw before is in my mind, is kind of irrelevant, right? So if you're selling a lot of it, that's great. But what really matters is how much you have as stores. And so if we take a quick look here, I'm going to use my cheat sheet so I don't have all these graphs perfectly memorized, as you may think. So number 1, right? Saudi Arabia. They have more oil than any other country by a long shot. But thinking back to the previous graph, they were number 3, right? They're pushing out the 3rd largest amount, which shows you that number 1 and number 2 are burning through their reserves, which does not bode well for the future. So if you remember, number 1, at least according to that graph, is Russia. You can see that shown here with that little pink bar. Fairly narrow, but significant. Obviously, it's on the list here. The U.S., we're way smaller than that. So again, just thinking about how the math works out, having us leading the world in oil production does not look good for the future, because we don't have the oil to do that with. Venezuela. So Venezuela also has been in the news a lot lately. That's pretty much the economy in Venezuela is oil, and it's cheap. I was actually listening to the radio the other day, and the price of a tank of gas is less than their smallest piece of currency currently in Venezuela. Obviously, they're going through a lot of political problems right now. So they interviewed a lady there. She was saying, every once in a while, they charge me for a tank of gas. Usually, I just fill up for free, and nobody even cares because it's like water there. Um, and a lot of cruise ships and things like that, we usually go try to fill up in Venezuela. It's kind of that's a whole different game. But again, just looking at this graph, in the shades of kind of orangish yellow, that's the Middle East and actually Northern Africa. That's where the power center is. And again, that's OPEC, right? That's the nexus of OPEC. So oil sells, right? But who's buying? That's the big question. And who's buying is really what countries are using the most oil. So this is actually an interesting graph. It's actually almost 10 years out of date. It's from 2011. So take that into account when you're looking at it. I take it with a grain of salt. But it does show us a trend, right? So these numbers may not be completely accurate in 2019, but the general trend is. And so this is showing us the blue bars that are going in a positive direction. That's production in barrels of oil per day, right? So that's how much that country is producing. And then shown in the red, that's how much that country is consuming. So first off, I would say the United States probably doesn't look like this anymore. We have increased our oil production over the last 7 or 8 years, the time since this graph was published. But there are actually some pretty standard stories here. So if we look at, again, on this graph, the United States is using far more than it produces. But other places, Saudi Arabia and Russia, and this is still the case, they're producing way more than they're using, which means they have a much larger surplus and much more oil money coming in. Places like Japan, which again, this story hasn't necessarily changed, they don't extract oil in Japan. They don't have the geology that's conducive to that. They're basically a big volcano, not going to host oil. So the oil that they use, they have to buy entirely from other markets, right, from the global markets. So they would be the type of place that's very interested in getting off of oil. As we kind of move down, you can see again Canada, surplus. The other thing I want to highlight on this graph, which is very subtle, is there's kind of an average for each country of where they finish when you compare the production versus the usage, and it's represented as a little green dot. So in a perfect world, at least you can see on this graph, Brazil's little green dot is right on 0, meaning they are petroleum neutral, right? So they're producing just as much as they're using. In the United States, you can see our little green dot's down pretty far. Saudi Arabia's green dot is way up in the blue, as is Russia's. And that's true. You can see Canada, Mexico, Iran shown the same way. The UK is just a little bit lower. And then again, Venezuela being in the news. So Venezuela has a huge oil reserve. They're not the biggest player on the global market, or at least as big as they could be. But they don't consume very much. And so again, you can see Venezuela is a great example of a country that has a surplus rather than using more than they do. So it's something that we talk about all the time, right? It gets into political discourse, this notion of becoming dependent on foreign oil, or are we using our own oil? Again, I think there are a few solutions and a few ways to talk about this problem, but the most important thing to think about is to really understand the problem, right? So we have no control of where the oil is or how much oil there is in those particular locations. That's kind of the geological roll of the dice. There are places who have incredible reserves, but the political infrastructure is frankly a FUBAR, right? To use a famous acronym. It's pretty messed up, right? So Venezuela is a great example of that. Like they could, with proper infrastructure and proper kind of governmental checks and balances and power and all of that sort of thing, they could be doing great, but they have a lot of corruption, and money corrupts, right? So there's a lot of oversight that's not necessarily there. At the end of the day, the Middle East runs the oil world. OPEC sets the price. We like to tax it, of course, because cars produce CO2 and they beat up roads and all that stuff. So we do tax it to pay for infrastructure. But beyond that, solving the problem of oil, I think algae is a good solution. Gas, increasing mileage is a good solution. So there are lots of ways to do it. There's not really just one magic bullet, but deciding which magic bullet you like to think about is up to you. And I think that it's helpful just to understand how this all works. All right, well, I'll see you in week 8. So next week we're going to talk about coal, which we've actually kind of talked about a little bit already, cellulose and all of that. So coal is really famous because its usage its heyday was prior to oil. Okay, well, I'll check in with you later. All right, bye.